Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Scrum Sessions Podcast. I am Q.
And I'm Gary On, and we have a very great episode for you today. It's actually the second part of an interview we did with Dr. Jeff Sutherland. If you haven't listened to the first part, I suggest that you go back and stop right now and go back and listen to the first episode first. If you have already done that, we have the second episode coming up for you now, and it's a really good one.
Thank you, Gary On. And here's part 2 with our interview with Dr. Jeff Sutherland.
Brandy, you go next.
Sure. Hi, Jeff. Thanks so much for doing this today. My question, you touched on a little bit at the beginning. I was curious to know of the companies you worked with when they did go remote with COVID, how they kept their Scrum aligned and moving, and if you think remote work is here to stay.
Well, remote work is not only here to stay, it's always been there. So the big challenge in scaling is when you add more people, you add more teams, things slow down. The performance per person or per team slows down. And this was illustrated by a phenomenon called Brooks' Law. And Brooks was the head of the IBM 360 project, wrote a book called The Mythical Man Month, which is a classic. And he says, every time you add people to a project, it makes it later than it already is. So in 2007, I think it is, we published a paper on a scaled Scrum in the United States and Canada that need to significantly expand operations. And they decided to double the number of their teams by going to St. Petersburg, Russia for half the teams. And the CEO made a really important decision. He said, I'm going to have every team be half in Russia. So all teams were remote. And you can read in that paper how they were set up. But the interesting finding in the paper, when it went for publication in the IEEE Digital Library, the academic reviewers said, you know, Jeff, you've written this paper about performance, but really this paper is the first time anyone has been able to break Brooks' Law, because you doubled the number of teams and the performance per team more than doubled. Or I would say the performance per team went up. So the total volume of delivery more than doubled when you double the number of teams. That has never been seen ever in the history of IT projects. So once we understood that and how that was set up, we knew how to make remote teams scalable, right? And so for those organizations we're working with in COVID, if they're in our programs, in the registered programs, they know what to do, right? So for example, a big pharmaceutical company, VP sent me a note when COVID hit. He said, thank God we started doing Scrum, last October, because here we are in March and now everybody's remote. In less than a week, we're back to normal production. All our competition is going to be stuck until COVID's over, and then they're going to be digging ourselves out. So for companies like that were agile coming into COVID, the big companies are publicly traded, their stock prices just went to the moon, and their competitors either flatlined or went out of business. So we know how to make this work remotely. Remote work is not only here to stay, it's always been there. Some of the best teams in the world have done remote right. In fact, if you have a really big project, you're going to be having people from many different places participating. You have to be able to do remote work.
Okay, very good. Back to you, Octavian. You're next.
Hello, Jeff. A question about the future from Paris, France. So I'm wondering how will look like the next Agile framework after Scrum? And by the way, did you start working on it?
Well, this is like classic. What's the next Lean framework after Lean? Let's look at what's happened. Okay, so the Lean was invented 50 years ago, and more than that probably now. And there's thousands of Lean companies in the world, but Toyota is still the only one that does it well. at least in certain parts of the organization. And what Toyota is finding out is that Scrum is next, right? Because they say Scrum is, Lean is Kaizen, small interval improvement. But what they tell us is Scrum is Kaikaku, because you're changing the organization, right? The Japanese tend to be command and control, micromanaging, and this totally turns that upside down. So then the question is, what's going to happen after Scrum? Well, the challenge is with Lean, it took over 50 years for something to come along that would actually not replace Lean, but extend Lean, because Scrum is based on Lean. And the reason it took so long is because Lean is a framework for process improvement. So the Toyota found that people would come and visit Toyota in 2000, and they say, you're not doing what we're doing in Lean. And Toyota would say, well, you're using tools and technologies and approaches that we were using in 1990, but we've moved way beyond that in 2000. And so we're doing things you never heard of because you haven't been improving, right? So Scrum is like that. It's a process improvement framework that's always going to be improving. And so to get something better, it's a real challenge to do that. But I can tell you what's happening right now. A lot of you are software people. I'm running a healthcare startup, and I'm interested in implementing the latest thing from OpenAI, which is, I think it's called GPT-3. And it's an AI that will write your computer program simply by you telling it in plain English what you want. I want an app with this title. It has these data items. Here are the boxes I want to see. I want to be able to search on this, search on that, select this and select that. You just say it just like it is, and the AI creates that program. And it's creating a huge uproar in Silicon Valley right now that people are saying, in a few years, will there even be programmers? Will there ever be programmers again, right? We're all going to be replaced. Okay, so in that environment, what's beyond Scrum? What I can tell you is I was in Zurich some years ago, and a senior person from the IBM research lab in Zurich came to one of my sessions, and he said, we're implementing Scrum in AI at Zurich, at the IBM research lab. I said, wow, that's really interesting. Do you think it will work in a computer? He said, we know if it works for humans, it will work in a computer. And I said, well, how do you deal with, the backlog constantly changing and updating? He said, oh, we need a new kind of chip that can automatically change its behavior. But he says, we have that. So what's going to happen is the AIs are going to be using Scrum, and they'll probably figure out something better.
Very good. Thank you. So back to the States. Ramesh.
Thanks, Q. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks, Jeff. So one of the lean principles is avoid wasteful activities or MUDA. So as a Scrum Master, what thought processes or techniques should we be following to identify wasteful activities during software development?
Well, the whole Scrum framework is designed to surface impediments. And what we've used at Scrum Inc. since almost the very beginning. I was in Sweden, and I came back, and Sweden had been using the happiness metric to run their company. They said, if happy people produce more stuff, and that drives revenue. And I had also spent some time in France then, and one of the leading lean executives came to my Scrum training, and he said, Jeff, you're not spending enough time on process improvement in the retrospective. The purpose of the retrospective is to identify and prioritize the impediment that's going to be fixed in the next sprint. And they have to put that in the backlog for the next sprint, or they will not be effective. So there are patterns now in the Scrum Patterns book for this, but I came back to Scrum Inc. and we immediately implement that in the retrospective of Scrum Inc. We're going to put an impediment in the sprint backlog in the next sprint. And I said, let's use the happiness metric from Sweden to decide what impediment. So we went around and we said, okay, to everyone, given what's happened this sprint, what will make you happier next sprint? And then when the Scrum Master had a list, then we would have a discussion, okay, from the team's point of view, what was going to make the whole team happier given the individual information that we have? And then we would prioritize that, and that would be in the backlog of the next sprint. And the very first time we did that at Scrum Inc., they said, we want new space. They were working in a venture capital group, and it was too noisy, and they weren't treated as well as they wanted to be. They wanted new space. And so within one sprint, 1 week, we had a contract on new space. Now, the interesting thing about that way of working is I found that over 90% of the time, the thing that will make the team more happy is something that will make the work easier and less frustrating. And as soon as you make the work easier and less frustrating, velocity increases. So, I would always recommend to a Scrum Master is that they try this out because it's just extremely effective. And this healthcare startup I'm working on right now, I'm really I'm the product owner, but I'm in the retrospective, and one of the things I'm asking every retrospective, what's going to make people happier next week, right? And we've increased velocity 500% in the last 6 months, and we need to double it again. But we keep asking that question in the retrospective.
Okay, very good. Soren, you're next.
All right. Thank you for your time, Jeff, and thank you for the invite, Luis. My question has to do with a somewhat unusual, I think, scenario where a team for historical and technical reasons ended up managing, maintaining, developing a large portfolio of point solutions. And none of these point solutions is large enough to warrant its own team, a full-fledged team, and none of them is active enough from a development point of view to warrant that either. They're owned by a few different people, so you have multiple product owners, and they have different stakeholders within the organization. So my question is, any recommendations or thoughts on how the backlog for the team should be managed in this scenario?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it sounds like you've got a product owner owning every one of those pieces. Some product owner owns it.
Right.
So now the product owner team needs to get together and figure out what's the best way to support these multiple features, what will be the most effective in terms of flowing backlog into teams. We found I remember MIT had this huge problem because their IT infrastructure, it's basically work off grants. So they have, hundreds of grants in a year. Once a grant is over, there's no more funding. But they have a system now out there that has to be supported. So
very similar model, similar to
what do we do? And so they weren't doing anything, So like 1,000 people are down. What do we do? And nobody does anything. And then maybe a couple of weeks later, they've got 1,000 people meeting. So they have a management meeting. And then the management meeting says, well, maybe we ought to do this, but it's a month later and still 1,000 people are screening. Finally, out of desperation, some manager grabs someone and makes them work all night to get the people off their back. And I pointed out that that's extremely inefficient. And what they should do is implement the interrupt buffer, which is a pattern in the Scrum book in our registered Scrum training. These patterns are fundamental. You cannot get a high-performing Scrum without these patterns. And one of the patterns is the interrupt buffer. In MIT's case, if they had an interrupt buffer for 100 teams, and they got one of 1,000 grants that is no longer in existence with this product that has to be fixed. Then the product owner team figures out, okay, we have 100 interrupt buffers. Where do we put that problem? I explained to the management that could be solved in the next sprint with no management intervention by setting your Scrum structure up properly and have the product owners doing what they need to be doing. So there are ways to handle this.
Very good. We have 10 minutes left, so let's see second questions. Klaus, go ahead, man.
All right. Thank you, Q. And thanks for another round. So this next question is about spirituality and Scrum. So I personally have benefited from implementing the values myself in my daily life. And I was wondering, Jeff, if you have similar experiences, like on a spiritual level, has it improved your career, your life in a more spiritual way, inventing Scrum and living it?
Well, I don't usually talk about this much, but for when I was in Vietnam in 1966, 67, I went on R&R to Australia. I got a week off in Australia. Then I went down to Sydney, and I'm just hanging out. I went into a bookstore and I was trying to find something to read. And for some reason, I came on this book on Tibetan Buddhism. And that led into, from 1966 to 1993, being a student of Tibetan Buddhism. And I would go to Buddhist conferences. I was initiated by some of the most senior Tibetan masters. And in 1993, I was meditating on one of these Buddhist tankas. And I had this encounter, they talk about this, with an archetype, one of the goddesses. And she changed my life. And at the time, I was at Easel Corporation where Scrum started. And I would come into work every day after meditating, and things would happen. I would just feel impelled from my gut to do things that were totally different than what I would think to do. Okay, we have this problem. Okay, normally I would do X, maybe choose somebody out, but I would just feel impelled to handle it differently. And then Scrum emerged. So Scrum has emerged out of a spiritual practice. And it's because I would say that my spiritual guide understands how people work. She was the tutelary deity of the merchants on the Silk Road. So she's very wise about business.
Right.
And the way she thinks about business, it's almost like a family, particularly like an Asian family. How do you get people working together and helping one another out? And everybody's listened to, everybody's respected, everybody's treated well. And you need to create an environment where people feel good about what they're doing, which was completely different from where I came from, right? And where a typical manager comes from. And so that has radically changed my life, and it's given the world Scrum. And in one sense, Ken and I did not sit down and write down a framework or a methodology. Scrum came from somewhere else. And we tried to document it so people could use it, right? And so we have many experiences around the world. One of the greatest blessings I have is a Scrum Master or somebody comes to me and says, Jeff, you've changed my life. I remember a senior manager at an oil company in the UK. I happened to be in the head office. She catches me in the corridor. She said, Jeff, before Scrum, I had 1,000 people that I was working day and night and weekends. And they were always late. It was never enough. They were under so much pressure. She said, I was losing my soul. With Scrum, we've gone to a normal work week. We're getting much higher production. I've given the people back a life, and I have regained my soul. So at a deeper level, that is what Scrum is all about.
Very good. That was a great one. I remember I remember when you mentioned that one was what, Scrum Gathering Austin, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was that came to mind right now.
Yeah, in Austin, a Buddhist monk asked me this question, so exactly. I had to go public.
Exactly. That's why when Klaus asked me, hey, can I ask that kind of question? I said, I think you're going to be surprised, you know. So, Ramesh, you got the last one.
Thanks, Q. Thanks for the opportunity again. Thanks, Jeff. So my second question is like very short. So what are some of the activities that the Scrum Master should be doing in order to increase the flow?
The thing I recommend the strongest, I remember I was working with this team in India. I was working with a Netherlands company who had operations in India. And they had an Indian team building some Scrum tooling. And they wanted to know, I was working with them from the Netherlands, and they wanted to know what metrics should they put in their Scrum tool. And I said, there's only one that matters, and that is process efficiency. The process efficiency of each story. You know, what is the actual work time divided by the clock time for each story? And so they said, okay, we'll put that in for the next sprint. So they started the next 2-week sprint. On Monday, they had that data metric. By Wednesday, they had pushed the process efficiency to 80%. And Thursday morning, they were completely done with 2 weeks of work. And it was really funny because they called me up. We did all our work with Zoom. They were building actually kind of a Zoom thing into the Scrum tooling. And they said, we're done with everything in the sprint for 2 weeks, and we have no more backlog. We don't know what to do. We're going to have to go talk to management. I laughed. I said, I told you this would happen if you just did process. I was surprised it happened so quickly. What did you do to make it happen so quickly? They said, we just put 3 people on every story. Mm-hmm. So to get that level of improvement in 3 days, that's a rare thing for a Scrum Master, right? So
yeah,
I would recommend you take a look at that. And today in Jira, if you use the Kanban plugin, it will calculate this for you. There's a metric called flow. And we use that in my team at Scrum Inc. all the time. We watch that flow. You want to get it up over 50%.
Very good. Okay, that was it.
All right, guys, we hope you enjoyed this episode just as much as we did. It was very interesting to listen to Dr. Sutherland's thoughts on all these different issues. Make sure you hit the subscribe button to not miss any of our future episodes.
Thank you, Gerion. And guys, stay tuned for episode 3 of the Scrum Sessions Podcast. I'll see you soon.